it's not the silence that hurts. It's the stories we attach to the silence that cause suffering. And most people fear being alone, not because solitude is painful, but because of what they believe it means. That they're not wanted, that something is wrong with them, that they've been left behind. But what if the very stillness you resist is the path to the life you've been asking for? In the West, we often equate movement with progress, noise with connection, constant engagement with value. But Eastern philosophy reminds us a fruit does not ripen through noise. It ripens in silence. When life removes you from certain people, when the invitations stop coming, when the phone no longer rings, it is not always punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. And it is here, in this quiet, uncomfortable space, that something sacred happens. You begin to meet yourself, not the version others applauded, not the mask you wore to keep peace, but your true self, unfiltered, unperformed, and grounded in something deeper than external approval. Neuroscience calls this state of inner rewiring the default mode network, where your brain is at rest but deeply engaged in self-reflection. Eastern practice calls it dhyana, deep meditation that pierces illusion. In solitude, your inner compass recalibrates. And if you resist the urge to rush out of it, if you can sit with what rises, you will find that this space is not empty. It is full of instruction. There are moments in life when everything seems to slow down. The invitations cease. The voices that once surrounded us fall silent. The presence of others diminishes, and all that remains is our own breath echoing in a quiet room. Many people feel panic in such moments, believing something must be wrong, that they are unloved, forgotten, rejected. But what if this silence is not abandonment, but divine recalibration? What if the quiet is the space where your soul is being aligned with a deeper truth? Solitude, when misunderstood, can feel like a punishment. But solitude, when embraced with clarity, becomes sacred ground. It is not where you are forsaken. It is where you are being forged. In the stillness, everything you have ignored rises to the surface. The truths you buried, the wounds you avoided, the strength you forgot you had. It is here, when all external noise fades, that the internal voice can finally be heard. Scientific research has shown that during moments of silence and solitude, the brain enters a state of high activity, particularly in regions associated with self-reflection and emotional regulation. It's called the default mode network. This is when the mind processes emotions, stores long-term memories, and makes sense of the past. This is not wasted time. It's a vital neurological reset. It's not stagnation, it's integration. In Eastern practice, this is why the monastery is found on the mountain, not in the marketplace. Not because the monk is avoiding the world, but because he is preparing himself to meet it with wisdom. In solitude, the mind settles like water left untouched. The debris of confusion, fear, and ego sinks to the bottom. Clarity emerges not through activity, but through stillness. There was once a woman who, after many years of pouring her heart into her family, her career, and her friendships, found herself unexpectedly alone. Her children had grown, her partner had left, her friendships had become shallow echoes of what they once were. She sat in her home and asked, "What now?" She tried to fill the space with distractions, television, busy tasks, even forcing new connections. But nothing filled the ache. One day, sitting on her balcony as the sun rose, she allowed herself to feel it fully. The loneliness, the silence, the uncertainty. And instead of running from it, she began to listen to it. She began to write, to walk, to meditate, to notice things she had never had time for before. The texture of light on her walls, the sound of birds in the early morning. Over time, she began to feel more connected than ever before. Not to others, but to herself. She later said, What I thought was emptiness was actually a return to myself. I just didn't recognize it at first. This is what realignment looks like. It is not glamorous, it is not loud, but it is deeply powerful. In this space, you begin to ask better questions. Not, why did they leave me? But, what have I been afraid to meet within myself? Not, when will I be loved again? But, how can I become someone who radiates love from within? Where emotional realignment doesn't happen in the rush, it happens in the retreat. And while the world may reward business, true transformation often demands pause. In solitude, you begin to hear the subtle whispers of your soul's direction. You begin to notice patterns, how you've been showing up in relationships, what wounds you've been avoiding, and where your own boundaries have been leaking. This is also where emotional clarity begins to emerge. Because when you're caught in emotional entanglements, clarity becomes a distant concept. Like trying to see your reflection in a stormy lake. The more you move, the less you see. But when you become still, the water settles. And with that stillness comes understanding. You realize which emotions were yours and which ones you absorbed from others. You notice the difference between loneliness and peace, between disconnection and sacred space. Modern psychology confirms what sages have always known: emotional space is necessary for emotional clarity. Without it, we are reacting, not responding. We are projecting our wounds onto others instead of healing them. We confuse trauma bonding for love. We seek people not to share life with, but to hide from ourselves within. A man once entered therapy after the end of a painful relationship. He believed he was heartbroken because she left him. But over time, he began to see that the pain went deeper, that he had used the relationship to distract from unresolved grief over his father's abandonment. That he had stayed not because he was fulfilled, but because he was afraid of being alone. When she left, he was forced to face what he had buried. And in that aloneness, he found the opportunity to finally heal. Not the relationship, but his own heart. This is the power of emotional space. It removes the noise. It confronts you with the real question: who are you when there is no one to perform for? When you no longer need to impress, to fix, to please, to chase? What remains when the audience disappears? That's where the true work begins. In ancient Eastern traditions, students often spent years in solitude before being allowed to teach or serve. Not because they lacked knowledge, but because they needed to refine their inner instrument. They needed to know their own minds before guiding others. Likewise, in life, there are seasons where you are called to step back, not because you're being sidelined, but because your spirit is being tuned to a deeper frequency. The modern world resists this. It tells you to post, to connect, to stay relevant. But wisdom whispers a different truth. Relevance without resonance is noise. Connection without clarity is chaos. Sometimes, the most loving thing the universe can do is to remove you from environments that distort your truth, to quiet the noise, so you can finally hear your own soul. This is not rejection, it's protection. And from this space, a strange and beautiful shift begins to take place. You stop seeking others to complete you. You stop begging the world to tell you who you are. And instead, you start building a home within yourself, a place where you belong, not because of what you offer others, but because you have learned to befriend your own presence. One woman described her transformation this way: "Before, I used to walk into a room and immediately wonder who liked me. Now, I walk into a room and wonder who I like." It changed everything. That shift only happens when you've had enough space to get to know yourself, your values, your boundaries, your emotional landscape. So many people rush into relationships hoping to find healing, only to discover more confusion. Not because relationships are wrong, but because relationships magnify what is already within you. If you carry unprocessed pain, it will spill out. If you carry desperation, it will show. But if you carry peace, it will stabilize everything around you. This is why time alone is not wasted. It is investment. Emotional space allows you to clean the mirror before you try to reflect love onto someone else. It lets you see clearly who you are, so you stop shrinking yourself to fit where you don't belong. In relationships, the most magnetic energy is not beauty, nor charm, nor wealth. It is clarity, emotional clarity, energetic stability. When you walk through life grounded in your own truth, you stop needing to convince others to stay. You stop chasing love that runs. You become the kind of person who can love deeply without losing themselves in the process. And that ability is born in solitude. There's an old story of a wise gardener who planted a bamboo seed. For 5 years, the seed showed no growth above the soil. The neighbors laughed, telling him to give up. But the gardener kept watering, kept nurturing, kept waiting. In the 6th year, the bamboo suddenly grew over 80 feet in just 6 weeks. What had it been doing all those years? Building roots, expanding downward so that it could grow upward without falling. That is what emotional solitude does. It builds roots. It stabilizes the unseen so that when love comes again, or opportunity returns, or community reappears, you are not swayed by the wind. You are anchored. You are ready. And readiness is not something you find in the arms of another. It's something you cultivate in the quiet spaces where no one is watching, where only your soul is present and your healing becomes your priority. So if life has led you into silence, if relationships have fallen away, if you find yourself alone and uncertain, do not rush to fill the void. Instead, listen, learn, sit with the discomfort, because within that stillness, something sacred is growing. And when it is time, you will rise, not seeking validation, but offering presence, not chasing love, but becoming love. And that begins here, in this sacred solitude. There is a misconception that wholeness is something we find in others, that once we meet the right person, everything missing in us will be filled. This idea is deeply woven into the way many people approach relationships, as if love is the destination where healing finally begins. But real relationships don't complete you, they reflect you. And if what's inside you is fragmented, unresolved, or hidden behind layers of fear, the relationship becomes not a sanctuary, but a mirror that amplifies the very things you were trying to escape. This is why solitude is not just space for rest, it's a place for reconstruction. When you are alone, you are not simply passing time until someone finds you. You are preparing yourself so that when connection returns, you are not dependent on it. You are able to give love freely without becoming enslaved to it. This readiness is not taught in most places. It is not modeled in movies or culture. But it is essential, because when you enter a relationship needing someone to fix what's broken, you hand over your power. You become vulnerable not in love, but in identity. There's a woman I once met who had been single for nearly a decade. Friends and family would pity her. They would say things like, "Don't worry, your time will come," or "You deserve to be loved." But what they didn't understand is that she was not waiting for love. She was growing into it. During those years, she traveled alone. She started her own business. She spent time studying emotional intelligence. She went to therapy, not because she was broken, but because she wanted to be clean from old patterns. And when a man finally came into her life, she wasn't desperate. She wasn't seeking completion. She was standing on solid ground. And so, the relationship became a partnership, not a crutch. She often said, "I didn't spend those years alone. I spent them becoming someone I would want to be with." From an energetic perspective, Everything in the universe operates by resonance. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you are. Two tuning forks of the same frequency will vibrate together, even across distance. The same is true with people. If you are filled with self-doubt, unresolved trauma, or emotional chaos, you will be drawn to similar frequencies. But when your energy is clean, when your heart is stable, and your mind is clear, you begin to repel what is misaligned and draw in those who meet you where you already are. This understanding changes everything. Instead of asking, "Where is the right person?" you begin to ask, "Am I becoming the right person?" Instead of looking outward, you look inward. You stop trying to chase someone who will understand you, and you become someone who understands yourself deeply. That awareness alone changes how you show up in love. In one study on attachment, researchers found that people with secure attachment styles, those who are emotionally balanced, self-aware, and not afraid of intimacy, experience longer, healthier, and more fulfilling relationships. But what's striking is that these secure traits were not always inherited. Many people learn them through intentional solitude, through reflection, therapy, mindfulness, and choosing to break patterns. Solitude becomes the training ground where emotional security is born. Not isolation, but intentional self-growth. This is why the time when you are alone should never be seen as a pause in your life. It is a season of construction. The world might call it a delay, but it's not. It's alignment. Because when you are whole, you love differently. You do not enter relationships to be saved. You enter them to serve. You are not afraid of walking away when something feels wrong. You no longer tolerate emotional chaos or settle for attention in the absence of respect. This strength is not arrogance. It is clarity. And clarity only comes when you've spent enough time in silence to truly know who you are. There's a story of a potter who once created two vases. One he shaped quickly, distracted, eager to finish. The other he took his time with, working slowly, revisiting it each day with care and presence. When the kiln fired, the first one cracked. The second stood firm. Someone asked him why the difference. He said, "The clay remembers how it was handled. When rushed, it resists. When honored, it strengthens." We are like that clay. Our inner readiness is not built in speed or noise. It is formed through patience, presence, and process. And in that process, there is often a temptation that arises. The temptation to force timing, to chase outcomes, to create movement when life has asked you to be still. But true readiness never comes from desperation. It comes from discipline. This is the paradox of divine timing. It looks like stillness, but it is the most active preparation you can engage in. When you feel left behind, when others move forward in relationships, careers, or families, and you remain seemingly still. It is not because you are undeserving. It is because your foundation is being laid deeper. The fruit that ripens slowly carries the richest flavor. And in the same way, your relationships, when built from internal peace, will hold a weight and depth that fleeting connections can never match. Patience is a forgotten strength in modern culture. Everything is urgent. Love is rushed. Conversations skip depth. Commitments are made out of fear of being alone. But when you learn the art of divine timing, you no longer rush into anything that threatens your peace. You trust the unfolding of life. You understand that what comes with force must be sustained with force, but what comes in flow sustains itself. There was a man who, after losing a long-term relationship, felt the urge to find someone new quickly. The silence was unbearable. The space triggered all of his insecurities. But instead of rushing, he chose to sit with it. He journaled, he cried, he explored his childhood wounds. He began meditation and slowly started to understand how his patterns had shaped his past. Years passed. He remained single longer than he expected. But when he finally did meet someone, it was different. There was no anxiety, no need to perform, no need to be rescued. The relationship became an extension of his peace, not a solution to his loneliness. This is the fruit of divine timing. It doesn't always come when you want it, but it always comes when you're ready to hold it with reverence, not desperation. Eastern thought often teaches the idea of non-striving, that when you let go of the desire to arrive quickly, the path reveals itself more clearly. This is not passivity, it is presence. Being fully available to the moment without dragging the past into it or projecting the future onto it. Relationships built from this place carry a sacred quality. They are not formed in urgency, but in awareness. They are not reactions to loneliness, but responses to alignment. So many people think they are waiting for love, but often what they are truly being called to do is become love, to embody it in the way they treat themselves, in the way they heal their inner child, in the way they learn to sit with themselves without judgment. From that space, love is no longer something you seek. It's something you naturally radiate, and what you radiate, you attract. When you have done the work of solitude and discipline, relationships stop becoming battles of insecurity and become platforms for spiritual growth. You no longer lose yourself in love because you've already found yourself in the silence. And so, connection becomes deeper. Not because it fills a void, but because it reflects a fullness already present. There's a proverb that says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But this doesn't just apply to academic learning. It applies to everything in life, including love. The right person often appears when your energy no longer holds the frequency of fear, desperation, or neediness. And that transformation happens not through external searching, but internal refining. This is why it is a gift when life removes distractions, when people walk away, when noise disappears, because in that space you are given a rare opportunity to reset, to refine, to become. And what you become in solitude determines what you allow in connection. Not everyone will understand your silence. Some will interpret it as loneliness, others as sadness. But only those who've tasted the richness of being alone with themselves will recognize it as sacred preparation. The world moves fast, but your soul does not rush. It ripens in stillness. And when it is ready, it does not chase love. It welcomes it. It does not cling. It receives. And that kind of love cannot be shaken because it is not built on fear. It is built on the deep foundation of someone who has mastered the art of being alone. There are two kinds of noise in life: the outer noise of the world and the inner noise of the mind. Most people try to quiet the first without ever noticing the second. They escape the traffic, the notifications, the expectations, but still feel chaos within. And that's because silence is not simply the absence of sound. It's the presence of stillness. And stillness does not come from changing your environment. It comes from transforming your relationship with your own thoughts. There is a certain kind of courage required to sit with your own mind without distractions, without another person to mirror your worth, without a task to validate your productivity. This is where true stillness begins, not just on the outside, but within. The kind that doesn't require external peace because it carries internal anchoring. It's a stillness that cannot be borrowed and it cannot be faked. It must be cultivated. The modern world does not often teach us how to cultivate this state. We are taught how to speak, how to achieve, how to compete, but rarely how to be still. And yet, stillness is where our clearest insights arise. Not when we push through confusion, but when we pause long enough for clarity to emerge on its own. Like water stirred by the wind, our emotions often become murky through movement. But if you leave the water undisturbed, the sediment slowly settles and clarity returns. Neuroscience offers an explanation for this. When the brain is constantly stimulated by external tasks, relationships, screens, or conversations, it becomes reactive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment and emotional regulation, becomes overtaxed. But when we enter states of reflection, such as mindfulness or solitude, the brain enters a healing rhythm. It strengthens neural pathways that foster emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and resilience. These are not just spiritual ideals. They are biological necessities. When your internal world is still, you stop making emotional decisions that cause harm. You no longer speak from pain. You no longer act from fear. You no longer confuse urgency for importance. This affects how you love. It affects what you tolerate. And most importantly, it affects who you become in relationships. There was a man who had spent his entire adult life moving from one relationship to another, unable to tolerate silence. He believed that the discomfort of being alone meant something was wrong, so he filled his life with noise, always needing someone to validate him, to keep him distracted from his own inner emptiness. But the patterns never changed. Each connection began in excitement and ended in confusion. Until one day, after another painful breakup, he chose not to replace the person. Instead, he replaced the habit. He turned inward. He began practicing stillness every morning, 10 minutes of sitting with his breath, his thoughts, his discomfort. At first, it was unbearable, but slowly, something shifted. The inner chaos began to soften. He began to notice thoughts he had never allowed himself to feel. Old wounds, griefs, fears, but also deeper truths. What he really needed in a partner, what he truly valued, what kind of love he was finally ready to give and receive. When he eventually entered another relationship, it wasn't from fear of being alone. It was from fullness. And because of that, it didn't feel like losing himself in someone. It felt like finally being himself with someone. This is the fruit of internal stillness. It's not perfection, it's presence. And presence is what allows love to grow, not through control or performance, but through truth. Stillness also creates boundaries, not the kind spoken with sharp words, but the kind that radiate naturally from inner stability. When you are still within yourself, you stop absorbing other people's chaos. You stop over-explaining, over-giving, over-fixing. You begin to recognize the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice, between understanding someone's wounds and allowing them to wound you. All of this becomes possible not because you've memorized boundaries, but because you've become grounded in a place no one can shake. In this way, stillness is not passive. It is deeply protective. Like the calm in the eye of a storm, it does not stop the winds from blowing, but it gives you a place from which to navigate them. You become less reactive, less pulled by emotion, less bound by the need to prove yourself in relationships, and more able to see others clearly, beyond their roles, their masks, their projections. This is especially important when it comes to emotional entanglements. When we are stirred inside by fear, longing, resentment, or anxiety, we lose the ability to discern. We begin to confuse chemistry with compatibility. We think intensity means connection, but intensity is not intimacy. Often, it's just the collision of two unresolved wounds. When you are still inside, you see these things more quickly. You no longer confuse emotional adrenaline for love. You can sense when someone's energy is chaotic. You notice when their words and actions don't align. And because you are not desperate for connection, you can walk away without bitterness. Not out of judgment, but out of integrity. There is a quiet kind of power that emerges when you realize you don't have to chase anything, that you don't have to beg for understanding, explain your worth, or convince someone to stay. That power is born in the silence you once feared. But to reach that place, you must first pass through the discomfort of aloneness. Because in the beginning, what stillness reveals is not always peaceful. It may show you where you've betrayed yourself. It may expose the ways you've settled, tolerated, or ignored your own needs to keep the peace. These realizations can be painful, but they are necessary because what remains after that is truth. And from truth, everything can be rebuilt. Sometimes the discomfort of being alone is not because you are empty, but because you are detoxing. Detoxing from attachments that were not real, from roles that became identities, from relationships that mirrored your fears instead of your essence. And as that detox completes, what remains is a deeper self, a self no longer needing applause, permission, or partnership to feel whole. Stillness is the doorway to that self, and from there, a strange transformation begins. Your peace becomes louder than your need to be heard. Your presence becomes more powerful than your opinions, and your clarity becomes more attractive than your appearance. This changes how you date, how you speak, how you listen, and most of all, it changes what you're willing to accept. Which brings us to the deeper truth that so many people miss: loneliness and preparation often feel the same. In fact, the emotional symptoms are nearly identical: emptiness, doubt, uncertainty, restlessness. The difference lies not in the feeling, but in the interpretation. One sees the silence as punishment. The other sees it as process. One asks, "Why am I alone?" The other asks, "What am I being prepared for?" Or perspective creates the entire experience, and perspective is shaped not by circumstance, but by awareness. With awareness, you realize that the absence of someone is not always loss. It may be grace. It may be divine protection. It may be the exact space required for your next evolution to unfold. There's a story of a woman who spent years praying for love. She journaled, meditated, made vision boards. But each relationship that came her way ended in disappointment. Until one day, she shifted the question. She stopped asking for love to find her and started asking what she needed to become in order to receive love that could last. That question changed everything. It made her reflect on the kind of love she had been modeling, the ways she had been abandoning herself, the boundaries she had allowed to erode. Slowly, she rebuilt her standards, not out of bitterness, but out of honor. And over time, her energy changed. She stopped attracting people who only wanted fragments of her. She stopped bending to be chosen. And eventually, the love she had once prayed for arrived, but it did not arrive to save her. It arrived to meet her. This is the preparation that solitude offers, not to help you attract more, but to help you attract better, not to fill your time, but to refine your essence, so that when love comes, you're no longer afraid to receive it or wise enough to release it if it doesn't serve your peace. And yes, it can be lonely. It can feel like everyone else is moving forward while you remain in waiting. But life is not measured in timelines. It's measured in readiness. And readiness doesn't come by accident. It comes through intention. It comes through choosing presence when distraction is easier, through choosing stillness when movement is more familiar, through trusting that what is aligned cannot be missed and what is misaligned will eventually fall away. So when the silence grows heavy and the stillness begins to feel like suffering, pause. Listen, not with your ears, but with your spirit, because in that silence, something is always speaking. Something is always shifting. And often, what feels like rejection is just preparation wearing a disguise. It is the pruning before the blooming, the breath before the leap, the soil being tilled before the seed can take root. And if you can honor that process, not just endure it, but honor it, then everything that comes after will not just be more beautiful, it will be more stable. because it will have been built on truth, not the kind you read in books, but the kind you found in the quiet when no one else was watching, and you chose to become whole anyway. There comes a point in every journey where solitude is no longer seen as emptiness, but as sacred preparation. What once felt like being left behind is revealed to be a redirection, a realignment with something far more meaningful than the temporary comfort of being surrounded. In stillness, you come to know yourself, not the self that performs for approval, but the self that exists beneath the noise, unshaken by rejection and unattached to validation. This path is not easy. It requires the courage to pause when the world says hurry. It demands the strength to remain grounded when loneliness whispers false stories. But within that space, wisdom grows, emotional clarity sharpens, and the inner foundation deepens so that you can build a life not on fear, not on urgency, but on truth. When you honor the season of aloneness, you stop chasing what doesn't belong to you. You stop shrinking to fit spaces you've outgrown. And you begin attracting people, experiences, and love that match the stillness, the strength, and the clarity you've cultivated within. This is not rejection. This is transformation, and it begins in silence.